young lovers do. Your heart is changing. Now we don't dance like we used to. Silent disco on the floor, baby. Mr. DJ, he'll get me through. When the beat's gone, you can't save me, baby.
This is Broad Radio. For you, by you. Broad Radio. Here for more.
Good morning and welcome to Broad Radio. I'm Jo Stanley. With me today as co-host is Serpil Senelmis. Hi there, Serpil.
Hello, Jo.
It's lovely to see you and your very electable hair.
Oh, thank you. I do have the electable hair.
You have fantastic hair. I really have always enjoyed it. Fantastic haircut. But, you know, I am, of course, referring to top of the show, this very interesting reveal that Dr. Monique Ryan, one of the most recent independents to be elected to our federal parliament, was described as having unelectable hair.
It's wild and it's got its own character. How can it not be electable hair?
Well, I mean, it's in reference to, and we're learning this because of this fantastic Four Corners story that was aired last night that Louise Milligan did, where she followed some of the women who were elected in this most recent election, including Dr. Monique Ryan, Zoe Daniel, member for Fowler Day Lee, member for Curtin Kate Chaney, some of these incredible women in those first few days as they were, you know, walking into Parliament House. What an extraordinary moment for them. And it was aired last night on the ABC and I watched it, and gosh, it was just an extraordinary insight into that moment of just imagine suddenly being a member of Parliament.
And you're thrust into the limelight, which you probably, you know, like in the case of a lot of these women, they other than Zoe Daniel, who had a TV career, probably weren't in the limelight, and suddenly you're there and your hair's being criticised because
exactly right.
Your hair's going to make all the policies, right? and all the changes, right, Jo?
That's exactly right. So Dr. Monique Ryan, there was a lot of talk about her hair being unelectable going into the election. And apparently, according to Louise Milligan and her tweet last night, that in fact, as the story was being aired on Four Corners, lots of talk about how appalling her hair is, even in the comments. Like, as you say, is the hair what we're asking to elect here?
Well, I mean, I don't understand why we concentrate on people's physical attributes to begin with. In a position like that, we've voted for people to represent us to make changes to us to policies and to make our lives better, in a sense, right? Mm-hmm. And it's a bit schoolyardy to be picking on people's physical attributes. I mean, you don't go around telling people like, you know, Peter Dutton, oh, you're follically challenged, so, we're not going to listen to anything you've got to say, or, you know, the same can go for Josh Frydenberg. There's a lot of bald blokes in politics.
He did. I will say Peter Dutton did receive a lot of physical sledging. And I wonder, because, you know, there's most definitely women cop this more. And we saw this, you know, when Julia Gillard was Prime Minister, it was ridiculous the amount of commentary that was in the media around what she was wearing and the way she looked and her voice.
And her hair again because of her partner.
Absolutely, yes. Dutton copped a bit of it.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you watch, you know, satire, he's always referred to as Voldemort. So he does cop it. I think once he was referred to as a potato. So yes, but I do actually agree with you that it happens more for women. What the shirt you're wearing, the earrings that you're wearing, how you blow dried your hair becomes the topic of conversation, as opposed to what you're actually talking about, the serious issues that you're trying to tackle, which waters down that person's authority. I think it happens less with men, and maybe because men just generally wear the same sort of type of looking clothing because they're all, you know, wearing black or brown or blue suits. maybe that's why. But there is that element of, I think, sexism to actually talking about someone's physical attribute. Like, who cares what her hair's like?
It's incredibly reductive, particularly in the case of someone like Dr. Monique Ryan, who is at the top of her game as a paediatric surgeon. Let's not reduce her to her unelectable hair. You know what, though? It makes me laugh in as much as you kind of got to dive into the lunacy of it, right? And for me, I go, what would be unelectable about us, Serpil, if I was going to ask you to suggest what might people go, well, I can't elect her because of this?
You know, for me, I think it would be my temper. I see red like instantaneously, and I think it might be actually a strength to begin with. So I would be a really good debater in Parliament, and then I might burn out really quickly because I'm a bit like the Incredible Hulk, but I don't wait for my muscles to bulge and the clothing to rip off. I'm green straight away.
Okay, I love this. If you're joining us live on Facebook or YouTube, maybe share with us what would be unelectable about you. I will tell you, just because I've had the benefit of many years of people, you know, unsolicited feedback on what they find offensive about me.
Okay, tell us.
I have an unelectable chin, I would suggest, because I have got quite the long face, and for many years I would get, and not so much of late because I just think people just can't be bothered so much anymore, but I was, I would receive many long, lengthy letters. And back in the day before social media, sometimes there were handwritten letters sent to me to tell me how long my chin was and how offensive it was to look at my very long chin.
So let me get this right. So a human took the time to take out a pen, a piece of paper, and write a long form letter dedicated to your chin.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And did my mum have sex with Jay Leno? And do I take children's eyes out when I turn my head? And how offensive it is. And you know, that's the sort of thing where you go, I mean, I can't do much about my chin, such that, you know, Dr. Monique Ryan can't do much about her hair.
I think you should be unapologetic about your chin, as she should be unapologetic about her hair rather than being unelectable.
Well, I'll take that on board. Not that I would run for Parliament, let me tell you. But I'm going to look, I took my very long chin off to the theatre the other night, and people were able to see past it to the stage. So... I was lucky enough to see, when I went to the theatre, the Melbourne Theatre Company, who have done this very beautiful adaptation of Alice Pung's book, Lorinda. It was adapted by the delightful comedian and now playwright, Diana Nguyen, who I hope is joining us now. Hi, Diana. Oh, no, we've got no audio from you. Oh, that's disappointing. She is in her car.
I'm here.
Oh, there she is. Hello. You are joining us from your car because you're about to head into work. So I appreciate that you haven't got your usual standard of production, which you are, because I know that you have your own live and podcast video. You have the Snortcast. All of it looks beautiful, and you've compromised for us today, Diana. Oh, no, I'm not sure that her internet's enjoying us. There she is again. Hello.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Darling, thank you for joining us from your car. What a joyous opportunity to write a play for MTC and adapt this very beautiful book. What an incredible gift.
Thank you. We had you were there opening night. It was, you know, in the room we had audiences who heard the joy but also the heartbreak of what it was to grow up Asian Australian, and probably for the other people who are also growing up Australian, and you know, we wanted to share the heart and the family story. So the heart for me in the story is, you know, when Lucy Lamb goes home to be with her family, and you see the three-dimensional home life, and how, you know, teenagers interacted with their parents, and how, you know, how crazy and awful but also joyous in that too. So we're very grateful that we were able to put this on main stage.
Hey, Diana, I know that you were adapting this play in 2020 when, you know, the world was thrust into a pandemic, and unfortunately, you know, at the time we saw a real uptick in anti-Asian racism at the time as a direct result of that. What was going through your mind when you were adapting this play, and did that sort of influence your approach to the play with everything that was going on around you?
It definitely did. So early March, before COVID hit Melbourne, I was hosting my Snortcast comedy lineup show in Melbourne, and we hadn't got into lockdown yet. But a week before, I was going up to patrons up in a comedy venue, just saying, "Would you like to buy a ticket?" And I approached these 4 white men and said, "Would you like to sell you $10, support artists?" And then they made a COVID Chinese joke, and this was before lockdown happened. And, we've seen the hashtag Stop Asian Hate penetrate the world, and we saw Black Lives Matter penetrate the world in the last, 2 years, where I thought that racism wasn't overt, it was more subtle, but these men decided to tell me that I was different, and that, I should be on the receiving of that as a 37-year-old woman. And hence why, when Petra and I wrote this play together, we saw the beauty, and we saw the privilege and ache of what it is to grow up as a teenager, but we also want to show how that still sits with you as a woman in her 30s. And that was really important for us to name it, that racism and privilege doesn't end when you're a teenager. It follows you as an adult and as a woman, and that's what you see in Lorinda today at MTC.
So what do you want audiences to take away? Because I was there on opening night, and one thing I really noticed is that it was a lot of young people in the audience, which I love to see, that real diversity of age and diversity of culture as well. What are you wanting to communicate? And what, because I tell you that the place sat with me for days.
It's sat with you years, and I've seen the show 8 times already. I'm quite addicted to it. And I think why I'm so addicted to Lorinda is the power that future writers and creatives and young people, to see themselves on stage, to see themselves heard, to see that there is a voice that's cutting through the noise of, we're Australian. It's we're hyphens, and it celebrates the hyphen. Either you're Vietnamese Australian, or you're Asian Australian, or you're Asian Australian Vietnamese, like whatever that combo is. For me, when I see 7 actors stand on stage and say my lines that Petra and I wrote, it is empowering for, I believe, the next generation to do exactly the same thing. And I've been doing this for 17 years, and I can't maintain that forever. So I hope that someone decides to, go, "Oh, someone wrote a play. I want to do the same thing too." And it will create a new generation of voices. And that's the biggest joy. And I hope that the change that we see in the next 5 to 10 years.
Diana, the main character in the play has a choice between fitting in and succeeding, or being true to herself. And as a hyphenated Australian myself, that was always a balancing act for me. And now that I'm older and wiser, I realise that a lot of the time I was actually code switching without realising it. So, like, for instance, I spent 2 years wearing green contact lenses at uni, and then when my classmates realised that, oh my God, she has brown eyes, it was a revelation to them. Did you find yourself having those internal fights as well when you were growing up?
Definitely. I went to school when I was in grade 3. It was a white primary school, and I was the only Vietnamese girl who entered it. And I remember my first day, kids were like noticing my nose, and they would say, "Your nose is flat." And I was like, I don't know what to do with that information. So I would just laugh along with it. Also, being in the industry, I've been doing this for a very long time. I remember I used to celebrate my tokenism. I used to celebrate being the only Asian in the cast because I was the special one. And that was very problematic, because I was now elevating myself on a pedestal so that other Asians couldn't. I was actually celebrating that I was better. And I've completely changed that mindset, because that's damaging, especially when you're in an industry that already marginalizes and tokenizes Asian Australians or any other person that's different from, you know, a white Caucasian person. That, you know, what Joe said before and asked, like, what's so empowering is that we have 7 actors who are not tokenized. They are standing in their own body. They're standing in their own voice. They are surrounded by people that look like them. They have shared experiences. And we're taking the word token away and saying, this is who we are. You can take it or you can leave it.
I think there's real power too in that an audience that you're normally going to be perhaps seeing at an MTC production generally aren't those sorts of, you know, you're not seeing Asian faces a lot in an MTC production audience, right? You're speaking to like people that look like me, right? So it's incredibly powerful from that point of view.
Yeah, and we know that this show is I feel it when I'm sitting in the audience, and I really enjoy it when people feel discomfort from it. You know, there's a reason why we don't translate the Vietnamese. Like, you actually are sitting, you know, sounds like. We don't want you to read subtitles and be distracted from the heart, from the movement. That was a directional choice. It was a direction to have 7 actors play seeing characters who are not of their nationality. We decided, you know, whiteface. We took that. We said power to us, because for decades and we've been, we've been replaced by others. They couldn't find any Asian actors to play those roles. So I love discomfort. You know, that's why I do comedies, that you can have permission to do that. And I feel very lucky that I'm allowed to do that at MTC, in a place where, you know, shows are not from my stories that are shown usually. So yeah, it's very powerful.
Yeah. And I imagine there's a level of cultural and community responsibility that comes with putting on a production like this. Do you find yourself checking in with community to make sure that, you know, you're not offending anyone in the community, because you're representing a group of people essentially?
I know, it's so interesting. You know, when Crazy Rich Asians came out, people were offended and said, that's not me. But I'm also, you know, challenging that. Why is it my responsibility to represent a whole community? I'm a playwright, I'm a comedian, I'm a human person who has experience, and we're also adapting a novel as well. So there's all these things coming at you, and that's why we made that decision to specifically speak to the heart of a Vietnamese home. So we're not trying to fulfill every Asian Australian experience and opinion. We're going into specifically a home that I have seen and felt. And so I do challenge, like, if you feel like Lorinda or any other play you see, it doesn't speak to you, then go and write your story and share it. And that's when we will have multiple stories in the world that doesn't rely on that one token person. My responsibility to carry you. I can't carry everyone.
No, it's too much. It's ridiculous. And yes, let's hear all the multiple stories. Like, there are so many, and they're nuanced and fascinating and interesting and inspiring and beautiful and all of those things. Let's hear all of them. I know that you're in the car and you're about to head off to work as a clown doctor. Oh my gosh, there you are, dressed as a clown doctor. Diana, the things you do, I just love it. What is it like, very quickly? The internet's not being our friend right now, but can you very quickly give us a snapshot of what it's like as a clown doctor?
It's the biggest joy of mine. I realise I don't need 500 people at MTC to make me happy. It can just be one child or parent that I shift and move in my work. And that's when I realised that that's why I love performing, is because I can do that to any audience or any person. So I'm very grateful to have this work.
Oh, we love it. Go and see Lorinda, mtc.com.au to get tickets. It's beautiful. I know that it's going to tour the country as well, so you don't have to get yourself to Melbourne. Wait for it to come to you. Thanks so much, Diana.
See you guys.
See
Bye.
I'm in a new stratosphere.
Oh, gee, we've got some very creative, amazing women joining us today, and I am excited to welcome to the show a guest who has been a long time coming, because This is our third time lucky attempting to have the extraordinary Walkley Award winning cartoonist Cathy Wilcox on the show. Hi there, Cathy.
Hi, Joe. Hi, Serpil.
Hi,
Oh,
Cathy.
look, I'm so thrilled, and it's just the way of the world, right? That you just sometimes things happen. We don't make the connection,
Yeah.
but here you are. And I said to you earlier, for me, your cartoons kind of defined the last federal election, and you were a little bit bashful about that. Were you surprised that I said that?
Oh, well, I don't know. It just seems that there's an awful lot of cartoonists all kind of racing after the same target at the same time. So who's to know? But I think I did invest in it in a way. I don't always necessarily. I kind of went. I felt we self-censor, okay? As cartoonists and commentators, we self-censor because we become sensitive to the possibility that we might be being unfair. And I really don't want to ever be unfair and criticize things, people and groups and parties or whatever unfairly. But then you sort of kind of realize that ends up having a reverse effect, or at least the gaslight effect of thinking that you oughtn't criticize something because you'll be seen as being unfair, whereas what you're doing is criticizing something that is very much needing to be criticized. And I felt that there was so much going on in the lead up to the last election that was a kind of an accumulation of offences. An accumulation of offences against democracy and transparency and accountability and all those sorts of things. And I just kind of went, well, I don't think I need to hold back. I don't think I need to, try and be even-handed or criticise both sides to the same extent when one side is the one in power and the one using the power the most. So I kind of did go, this has to be pointed out. By the way, as you noted earlier, the canine interruptions are a feature of your show. My canine is interrupting us, and so I can just introduce Tilly the dog. Hello there.
Hi,
Hello,
Tilly.
Tilly.
Caught the neighbour who was taking her dog for a walk, and we often walk together. So Tilly is there. She's just come in, and she's excitedly telling me she's had a great time. Thank you.
I love it.
Tilly. Yes.
So Cathy, when you say that you self-censor, is that partly because you're fearful that you'll receive trolling or a pushback that's quite unpleasant?
Probably at some level. At some level, I think I'm. I hate to say it, I think I might be thin-skinned, and people will say, "Oh, yeah, you can dish it out, but you can't take it." That's totally true. I can't take it. No, it gets under my skin. But no, I think that in some regards, like if it's trolling, actually, if it's just so clearly a troll, and if it comes in on Twitter and it's by some a-hole who has 2 followers and and he's got an Aussie flag and a bunch of little symbols beside his name and a bunch of numbers before his fake name and all the rest of it, damn well that is not coming from a sincere and heartfelt place. The pushback that you are more afraid of is the people whose regard you care about, and that's where the sort of the modern propagandist is making the most of that fear of being criticised. So it's all got really complicated these last years. Things have got complicated because. So I tell you that I'm sensitive to justified criticism. I have to go away and think about it, and I also have to interrogate whether the criticism is justified. I can't, unless it's so obviously partisan kickback, somebody just, oh yeah, you bloody lefty greenies or whatever, that's obvious enough to be able to just dismiss because they would say that sort of thing. But I have encountered also this other kind of criticism, which I see as being, well, on the one hand, it might be thoughtful people urging me to have a deeper thing, but also this is used by people who have a very strong interest in sowing doubt. And that is the sort of the people propagandizing for such as the Russian cause or, sort of various other causes where the criticism you get is quite personal. It often comes to you directly. It comes directly as an email rather than on Twitter, and it comes in with the tone of, "Oh, I'm really disappointed that someone like you would say that thing you said in your cartoon. I thought that someone like you would have known better than that."
Oh,
and
it's so patronising.
Yeah.
Apart from anything else.
It's patronising and it's niggling.
Yeah.
And it took me a few encounters of that to go, I see. I see this is actually a well-worn technique. And if you read the email out in a Russian accent, in a bad Russian accent, it usually reveals itself,
That's right.
So Cathy, it's an interesting thing that you mention about, the criticism and the self-censoring and the trolling, because this is pretty much the world we find ourselves in. But you didn't start off like that. When you started cartoons, we probably just had letters to the editor. But now we've got this, we've got keyboard warriors, this culture of 24/7 outrage. How has that shifted your approach to cartoons from when, back in the days when we only had to deal with letters to the editor?
It's a really good question. It's a really valuable question, and it just changes everything. Back in the days of letters to the editor, if someone liked your cartoon a whole lot, you might get one letter. On the Twitters, if someone likes your cartoon, you might get 500, 1,000 likes or something like that. And so from the early days of Twitter, I remember a friend of mine who was an actor saying, and she wasn't a fan of Twitter and all that sort of stuff, and I was still new to it, but she said, "Oh, isn't it just a bunch of self-affirmation? You just sort of need to have your ego stroked." And I said, "You're an actor, so here's the scenario. Let's do your performance, silence in the room, and then 3 days later somebody follows you up on the street to say, oh, by the way, I really liked your performance on that in that play," because that's what it used to be like with the letter to the editor that might roll in days later. Otherwise, you're doing your stuff in a kind of in a dark quiet room, putting it out there, and you often wouldn't hear anything back, and unless maybe your sub editor who you filed your cartoon to felt the need to say, "Oh yeah, good one." So
you're tackling some really, really tough topics, right? Like you said yourself, looking at your cartoons, you've tackled everything from climate change to a climate of sexism, for instance. But is the job of a cartoonist to be polarizing? Is that the core role of a cartoonist, to get us to think deeply about issues? Well, what is the nub of the role of a cartoonist?
Well, it's definitely not to be polarizing, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I accept that there will be, you're putting up a cartoon about the debate about the voice to Parliament. And I could, you only could sort of see the arguments being warmed up to counter it, from these people saying, well, I wouldn't want to consider it unless I saw the detail. And they're the very same people who would go, oh, I'd reject those details, don't like those details. There's other ones that I can also reject. So you know that there's going to be some people who are going to, not be affected, and that to a large degree, you may well be preaching to the choir. But no, polarizing is pointless. I hope that the medium of cartooning is something that can actually just cause people to, pause for a moment, either to find that what they suspected, they're not alone in suspecting. When they think that something's dodgy, and the cartoonist kind of confirms that the cartoonist thinks it's dodgy too, and this is kind of a reasonable take.
Can I ask, Cathy?
It's questioning.
Well, we were earlier talking about this comment that Dr. Monique Ryan received about having unelectable hair going into the election. And this notion that these public figures, and it seems more, well, we know actually factually, because the research has been done, that women receive this much more than men. Is it fair game for you as a cartoonist to use someone's physical appearance in what you do?
Yeah, that's changed a bit too, hasn't it? that has changed a bit, and I've watched my own evolution in that space as well, because it was all just, like exaggerating all features was the way you drew cartoons from the very starting point, and from my early Bugs Bunny watching days. All these characters, I found them interesting. Also, as an art student and a life drawing student, I loved drawing different shapes of people, and then in caricature you kind of pull out the essence. I drew the legend for me is that in about year 8 at school, at a girls' school, I drew caricatures of all the girls in my class and instantly lost about 30 friends, because the girls didn't like being drawn in an unflattering way.
Did you draw their chin?
Oh yes. I would hope you would draw me with a very long chin.
I'm actually talking about your very long chin. You have a lovely face. I look at you and go, sure, that's how she looks, and she looks lovely. I also didn't see it as a bad thing. And I had another friend at school at that stage, the other girl in the year who could draw, and I figured I thought she could draw better than me, but she also drew prettier than me, and she could draw pictures of all the girls in the class, and they would love her for it because she could make them all look lovely and all that sort of thing. But I don't know, I never valued myself according to my looks. Like that was never currency in my life. I've never been the pretty one of the bunch, so that's easy to hide behind and draw other people and just kind of see them as curious. I'm dragging this out because you want an answer on things like, so what about when it was Julia Gillard or something like that, and what was that sexist to draw her with a big bum, and was it this and that? And I think it's really complicated, because on the one hand we're there with a drawing, and I'm doodling all the time. I'm always, with a pencil in the back of an envelope and probably a bill I should pay or something like that, but I ignore the bill and just draw on the envelope. But I'm always doodling, and I'm always going, ooh, what a face. And I actually find it really hard to follow TV news, for example, TV news and current affairs, because I'm so distracted by the visual. I'm looking at the faces and features and whatever of people, and I'm completely forgetting to listen to what they have to say. So I depend heavily on the audio current affairs and news to function. I have to hear the word rather than see, because I'm looking at something else. But I guess it all depends on where it comes from, because I defended the caricatures of Gillard back in the day by saying, well, it's only if you think having a big bum is a bad thing that drawing her with a big bum is bad. I would just say that she's, you're depicting a shape so that it's recognizable, and this is and caricature tends to exaggerate things, but then other people were doing it in a way that I guess was grotesque. But we do grotesque, don't we? We do. We want to draw Trump as grotesquely as we can. We take our liberties with Voldemort, and I think one of the Voldemort. Sorry, you all knew who I was talking about.
It's true. But and I guess that brings us to the conclusion when we were asking the question on our social media: is Cathy Wilcox fearless, cheeky, or a skeptic with a healthy BS detector? It's a little bit of column A, B, and C. But what you are is, you're calling it as you see it from you play a very important critical role, I suppose, to power, which a lot of people in power are not challenged, essentially. So,
I love the way that cartoons distill a really complex issue into this one really simple explanation, as opposed to a 2,000-word deep dive article.
Yes, because I don't have time to read a 2,000-word deep dive.
If I'm afraid, I try to push through that fear too. I do try to, if I detect that I'm afraid to talk about something, I think that must be something I should talk about. So I do kind of use that as a challenge, I suppose, that I need to push through.
Well, and I think that's a wonderful rule for life. If you're afraid, that's a good indication you should be doing it, perhaps. Cathy, thank you so much, and thank you for your amazing, very clever art, because it really is art, and it's I think we all gain a lot from it in the public discourse. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Joe. I could talk for hours, but you've got other people.
And thank you for Tilly as well.
Thanks, Tilly.
She's very patient.
She's my she has all my ideas for me. She's the brains. She's the brains behind this operation.
Thanks so much, Cathy. You have a great day.
Okay.
With my respiratory issues, I know I have to quit smoking. And quitting before I'm 40 means I'll live up to 9 years longer. What will your future hold when you quit? Make your next quit attempt at Chemist Warehouse.
Broad Radio. Talking inspo we love, info we need, and sharing more of us. Watch and listen live every Tuesday 9 a.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time at broadradio.com.au, or find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube and LinkedIn at Broad Radio Oz. Talk to us live. Call on 1300 8 Broad. Catch up on demand anytime, anywhere, every time, everywhere. On the train, we'll be here. 2 a.m. existential crisis? We've got you covered. Broad Radio. Here for more.
Well, Serpil, before we get to our final guest today, I felt that it was really important to mention that yesterday marked 1 year since the Taliban took over Afghanistan, and I felt like I needed to stop down and make that mention because I read this incredible story that was written by a 16-year-old girl in Afghanistan, and she was talking about how they are not allowed to go to school. So specifically with regard to that particular unfolding from the Taliban taking over a year ago. And the last thing she said was, please do not forget us. And that stayed with me, and I felt, with a view to not forgetting, let's just recognise that it has been a year since this terrible thing has happened to the people of Afghanistan.
It's heartbreaking, Joe, because education, we're talking specifically girls not being able to learn or work, and women, is a basic human right. And essentially what the Taliban has done is they've yanked that right away from girls and women because it's a way of controlling them. When you control them and you make them dependent on men for their survival, that is a way of making sure that men are continuously calling the shots. And I think one of the Taliban leaders referred yesterday to women as meek creatures that weren't allowed to do anything on their own. And I'm really passionate about this, Joe, because I've got a family perspective that I can bring into this because a couple of my aunties don't know how to read and write. when in the generation of my grandparents, so my background is Islamic, obviously things have moved on and changed since then, but in the generation of my grandparents, education on women was seen as total waste of time. And they were seen as mothers, and they were seen as, people who performed domestic duties. So my aunties don't know how to read and write. My own mother has very basic primary school education. So she's one of the lucky ones. So she knows how to read and write, but information bamboozles her all the time. And in one generation, I'm sitting here as a person who's got 2 university degrees. I can advocate for myself. I can make decisions based on whether information is rubbish or not. I've got the skills to decipher because of my ability to exercise critical thinking. I can make choices that are goal orientated to better my life. So my quality of life is so much better, and it's all down to one thing, education. And when that is yanked away from girls, we have such a poor society. And I think as women who sit here who have the privilege of education in a country like Australia, I think it's our duty to agitate for those women who don't have the voice or the power to be able to do that, so they are not forgotten, like that 16-year-old. Even in places like the US, with Roe versus Wade, we just saw that even in a so-called first world country, our rights can be wound back really, really quickly. So I think collectively, I really am really passionate about this. It's our role to agitate for their rights. So, we should be out there protesting. We should be demanding our leaders do more, international organisations do more. We can't just sort of sit on the sidelines and be silent about it.
Absolutely, and I think there's been some really beautiful stories around the fact that there are secret schools taking place in Afghanistan, and isn't that amazing that these people are risking their lives so girls can continue their education? That's wonderful. But let's not hail that as the answer.
That's right.
There's courage there that is truly incredible, but actually let's not leave it up to them and their courage. Let's advocate, as you say, and really push for this terrible ripping away of someone's rights, and hundreds of thousands of people, and women and girls particularly. Let's really call on our government to insist that there are 20,000 extra places that we need here in Australia. There are people that were promised asylum here that haven't made it here. There's people need to have permanent protection. There needs to be a clearing of citizenship backlog. There's so much that our government could and should be doing, and let's not forget these women and girls.
Yeah.
In a moment, our next guest, Dr. Michael Flood.
I'm in a new stratosphere.
So it does feel a long way from Afghanistan here, and as you say, Serpil, most certainly we enjoy freedoms here that make us very, very fortunate by comparison. Yet still, of course, gendered violence is endemic in our society, and there are campaigns to try to change that. I am very lucky to be a part of one such campaign. It's called Stop It at the Start, which is out of the Office for Women, the Federal Office for Women, and it's about having conversations with our kids about respect right from the beginning. But there are many leaders in research as well who are doing lots of things to shift attitudes to end the gender inequality that leads to gendered violence in Australia. And one such person is Dr. Michael Flood, whose Twitter feed is a constant source of information. It's a fantastic resource for me. He's a researcher into masculinity and violence prevention. He joins us now. Hi there, Michael.
How are you doing?
Now I understand we've already had a dog on the show, and you have a couple of cats who are lurking to join us as well. So we look forward to seeing them.
I've put them in the sun, so they may stay away for a little while. We'll see.
Oh, yes. Well, now, okay, so to more serious matters, Michael, your book is called Engaging Men and Boys in Violence Prevention. How do we engage men and boys?
Look, the first place to start really is with the sense that men and boys are both part of the problem and part of the solution. And to focus on the second of those, many men and boys already treat women in their lives with respect and care, but men have often stood by silently while a minority of men perpetrate violence and a larger number of men condone that violence, make jokes or comments, or in other ways turn a blind eye to that violence. And so men have an absolutely vital role to play. One of the ways we can engage men and boys is through respectful relationships in schools, through face-to-face education in schools. We can engage men as role models in sports, in workplaces, in their communities. We can use social marketing and communication campaigns to shift the norms and attitudes among some men and boys that feed into violence. The evidence is that those strategies work, but at this stage, in Australia at least, they're small and scattered, and they need scaling up.
Michael, is there a typical pathway to Australian manhood? Are there very clear geographic and class differences that influence whether our boys and men gravitate towards a culture of hypermasculinity that hurts themselves as well as, the women around them, their mothers, their wives, their partners, their sisters?
Look, there's two things. On the one hand, I'd say that in Australia, there are some common norms, some common kind of sets of expectations that boys and men face. And the Man Box survey, which was done by Jesuit Social Services in the last couple of years, the Man Box survey showed that among young men, substantial numbers felt still that to be a man is to be tough, to be in control. Substantial minorities of young men felt that men should be dominant in relationships and households and so on. And we know that most men don't use violence against women, but the men who do are more likely than other men to believe that men should be dominant in their families and in their relationships. They're more likely to have a sense of entitlement to obedience or deference or sexual access to women's bodies. They're more likely to be involved in relationships characterized by inequality, by dominance that they have over women and so on. And so the kind of common norms of masculinity do feed into the violence that some men perpetrate. At the same time, there's diversity. There's certainly diversity in Australia in terms of what it means to be a man, in terms of how gender roles and relations work. But if we want to stop the violence that some men perpetrate against women and girls, we will absolutely have to shift what are some pretty common ideals or norms of masculinity.
But also, and we know that we have a huge problem with male suicide in this country, with mental health issues in men in this country, depression, anxiety, and it's an epidemic, that in itself. And surely that's come from toxic masculinity, because I know the men in my life are not served by that version of being male.
No, look, that's exactly right. And so there are really two problems with our common or dominant models of how to be a man. And one is that they feed into the harms that some men do to women, violence, domestic and sexual violence, harassment, and so on. The second problem, as you've named, is they feed into harms among men and boys themselves. And suicide is a perfect example. Now, suicide among men and boys is shaped by many factors. One of those factors from a wealth of evidence is conformity to particular rigid norms of masculinity. Putting it more clearly, boys and men who believe that to be a man is to not ask for help, to be a man is to always be tough, to be in control, to not show weakness and so on, those men and boys are more likely than other men and boys to consider suicide and indeed to complete suicide. So while masculinity is not the only story, conformity to those particular norms of masculinity does to suicide among men and boys. Likewise, conformity to traditional or stereotypical masculinity also feeds into driving, into excessive alcohol use, into homophobia, into lack of involvement in parenting and so on. So I'm not saying that gender, the expectations, the norms that men and women face is the only story, but it's certainly an important story in shaping both the harm that some men do to women and the harm that boys and men themselves often suffer.
Before I ask my question, I just want to do the responsible thing. If this topic is bringing up anything for anyone at this point, there are organisations that you can reach out to, like Beyond Blue. I think it could be triggering for some people. I'm curious to know whether toxic masculinity is always overt, or can it lie dormant and rear its head when, men find themselves in a stressful situation and they don't perhaps have the tools or the skills to deal with their emotions or what they're feeling.
Or even not just a stressful situation, but if there's a peer group around them that insists on it.
Look, that's right. And look, I want to say too that I don't like the phrase toxic masculinity that much, because it's so often misheard by men and boys as hearing as thinking something fundamentally or intrinsically toxic about being a man or about manhood. Now, instead, what the term is meant to identify is a particular version of masculinity, one particular set of expectations about being a man that are toxic. Toxic for the men who conform to them and toxic for those around them. So assuming that, how toxic masculinity plays out in part is to do with men's own attitudes, men's own expectations of themselves and what they feel capable of doing. Do they feel capable of asking for help? Do they feel capable of, sharing the troubles they're facing with a friend, for example? But it also shapes men's peer relations, as you've said. And it's often men's expectations of how their peers, particularly their male peers, will see them, that shapes their own behaviour. And one problem here is that men often overestimate the man's support for toxic or rigid or narrow masculinity. And so part of what we need to do is actually turn up the volume on the actual diversity among men and boys, and the fact that many men and boys assume that everyone else conforms to those ideals but don't actually subscribe to them themselves.
Because, we have these campaigns around not being a bystander, and I think they're fantastic. I think they're wonderful campaigns. But are we arming the people that we're targeting with actually the strategies to step in where, they do observe disrespect or where they do observe a threat to a woman? Like, are we giving people strategies for that?
Look, I think we are, but we're up against some really significant obstacles. And one for men in particular is that many men, more so than women, many men simply aren't aware of or don't recognise low-level forms of violent or harassing behaviour. So many men will say, rape is bad, I would never hit a woman, those kinds of things, but not notice or turn a blind eye to much more everyday forms of aggression or disrespect that some men perpetrate against women. A second obstacle is that even when they are uncomfortable with those behaviours, uncomfortable with a sleazy joke about rape or a victim-blaming comment, for example, many men don't know what to do, don't know what they can say against a mate or against, a work colleague. And third, there's those kind of codes of loyalty, codes of male bonding, of loyalty, particularly to your male peers, that stop some men from speaking up. Having said all that, it is possible to shift those. And I do think in Australia, growing numbers of men are speaking up and saying, hey, that's not okay. You can't talk to her like that, or what are you doing? So we are starting to see some shifts, I think, in men's willingness to speak up in response to violent and violent supportive behaviours.
I think that's a really interesting observation, though, because I have had conversations with my husband and other men in my life where I've gone, you've got no idea what it's like to walk through, the city at night time, and that there's going to be comments. And until I actually had that first conversation with these men, they had no idea. They're like sort of oblivious. And I suppose if it's not been their life experience, why would they know?
Well, yeah, I mean, they've never had to cross the street because they don't feel safe. But whereas we've at some point experienced that. Yeah.
And I think for men, it's often hearing women's experience, particularly from a wife or girlfriend or a female friend or Rosie Batty on TV. It's often hearing women's experiences that sensitises men to this issue. Some men come to this issue too out of principle or ethics. Some men come to this because of their own experiences of violence. But it's certainly possible to sensitise men to the reality of women's everyday fears of men's violence and everyday experience of that violence, and to inspire and motivate men to actually start taking action, to actually start making change. And where that change has to start is with themselves. Men have to put our own houses in order and look at how we treat the women and girls in our own lives first, before we then start speaking out against our mates or challenging others. Although we don't have to be perfect. We don't have to have an angelic life to start to make change.
I mean, Australian women over the past couple of years have asked men to step up and to show allyship. And I love how some prominent men are stepping up. One of them is one of my favourite authors, Tim Winton, and he describes he had this description where he says that the boys in Australia get the tenderness squeezed out of them, and that they're marinated in a culture of violence. Is that a description that you would agree with when it comes to Aussie blokes?
Look, I think it's broadly true. I think it's shifting too, but I think that one of the ways that we socialize boys and men is to crush empathy in them, which means it's harder to empathize with women's pain or indeed the pain of others. And so I think that one of the things we need to do to shift the epidemic problems of domestic and sexual violence in Australia is to raise boys differently, to change how we raise our sons, to change how we treat boys and men in everyday life.
It does feel a little overwhelming as far as how large this issue is and whether it's going to be 2 generations before we see even a shift. Michael, your work it feels very important, but does it feel overwhelming sometimes?
Look, I suppose, as an advocate, as someone who tries to contribute to social change, I do have a kind of optimistic bent, and I do see that there are genuine signs of progress. There is greater community understanding than there used to be of domestic and sexual violence. There's greater community support for the idea that men can play a positive role in making change. At the same time, there's no inevitable progress, and there are some ways that things are going backwards. People seem more willing than they used to believe that women lie about rape and domestic violence, which is simply not true in general. There are growing online communities where boys and men are radicalized into a real kind of women hating, a real kind of sexism. So there's progress and regress, but I very much believe that individually and together we can make positive change.
And Michael, what's the influence of pop culture and social media? When you see cases like, the Johnny Depp Amber Heard case play out for so long in public, or, similar issues like that, does that actually have a negative impact on the progress that we're trying to make in these conversations?
Look, I would say absolutely. I think the Depp Heard case was very actively mobilised by anti-feminist and other individuals and groups to kind of entrench some real victim-blaming and violence-denying understandings. Social media influencers like Andrew Tate and others are very actively pushing what you would think of as misogynist or women-hating narratives about women and sex and violence and so on. So popular culture and popular media is a kind of critical place where we need to intervene. We need to hold social media platforms to account, but we also need to intervene directly so that we give boys and men in particular alternative, healthier, positive narratives about women, about sex, about dating, about relationships and so on.
And that leads me to a little plug for an event that you're doing in Victoria in October at the Gippsland Performing Arts Centre. You're doing an event called Fostering Positive Masculinities Among Men and Boys. What is a positive masculinity? How do we foster that?
Good question. So look, if a toxic masculinity is based on dominance, on aggression, on the repression of emotion and so on, then a positive masculinity is based on non-violence, on respect, on care, on compassion, on emotional health and so on. And what's really clear is that fostering those visions of how to be a man, how to be a boy, are good for women and girls and good for boys and men themselves.
I mean, I don't have a son myself, but I have lots of friends who are raising boys, and I have nephews as well. And I wish for that for those boys. I want them to have healthy, beautiful, really loving relationships throughout their lives. And I think, it requires a deliberate version of parenting. Would that be true?
Absolutely. And I say that as a parent myself of 2 kids, it requires a kind of self-conscious nurturing of positive forms of, identity and relationships among our sons and daughters and others. But it also requires explicitly challenging some of the really negative and sort of sexist messages that our children may get from popular culture, from pornography and elsewhere. So I think that doing that is part of a broader kind of plan of building positive communities.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you're holding back the tide sometimes. If you just sit down and watch Married at First Sight, and you're just like, what the hell is going on here? This is not okay.
Or don't.
Or just don't. Well, Michael, thank you so much for your perspective and your very, very researched information. I find it really helpful in my general discourse in life, and I really recommend people head along and you can download your book. Is that correct? Engaging Men and Boys in Violence Prevention.
You can. It's available from a website called xyonline.net. So the website xyonline.net has that book free in PDF and a wealth of other resources, whether you're trying to live a better life yourself or trying to contribute to social change.
Thank you so much, Michael, and enjoy your trip to Victoria when you get here.
Thanks very much.
Oh, a bit of a heavy end to the show, but very important.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
We've got to have those conversations.
Yes, we do. Meanwhile, we'll walk around with our very electable hairs and
and chin. Unapologetically, of course.
Unapologetically, that's right. Serpil, thank you as always for joining us on
Thanks,
Broad Radio, and we'll be back next Tuesday. We'll see you then.
Mirrors, pretty lights. Another runaway city boy getting too high. But boys like you tell pretty lies.